2021 Reflections on Current Contentions. I'm still amazed, more I guess with the press or the law schools, that they did not seize on Jen Psaki's comments last week anent the reissuing of a 2-year ban of Donald Trump on Facebook. She said this exactly, quote, "Our view continues to be, though, that every platform, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, any other platform that is disseminating information to millions of Americans, has a responsibility to crack down on to crack down on disinformation, to crack down on false information, whether it's about the election or even about the vaccine, as we're trying to keep the American public safe and get more people to normal out in society." Close quote. I'm still gobsmacked the media let Jen Psaki get away with this. I'm still amazed Jen Psaki got away with saying the quiet part out loud. What is that quiet part? As with Barack Obama's red line threat to Syria, the story was not that Syria breached it, but that they knew they could breach it with no response from Barack Obama or the United States, except outsourcing the Syria problem to the Russians. Please understand the authoritarianism in this remark made by the United States president's liaison to the journalist community. Quote, "Through every platform that is disseminating information to millions, they have a responsibility to crack down on disinformation, to crack down on false information," close quote. In times past, any times past, the notion that a government spokesperson, much less the president's, was willing to justify censorship based on government's position on things true and false, information versus disinformation, in times past, that person would have been lambasted. Every single case on press freedom and the First Amendment is about the government not having a say on what is true. And the point of the media is to hold the government accountable over concerns they would shade or manipulate or conceal the truth. Media outside of that which you can pick up at the cash register stand when you buy your groceries is not about reporting on private people's lives and keeping them accountable and honest. It's about the government. The notion of democracy, much less liberalism, is not that there are permanent yet legitimate facts the government must operate under, but rather self-doubt and transparency, because here the people govern as they see things and determine their own facts about the best public policy for their country. And because there are not permanent facts and truth the government gets to grand censor, that's why we have elections. There is simply no point to elections if all the truth and every legitimate fact is determined and controlled by the government with an unquestioning press. That simply requires the first and leading example of what democracy is not, except I guess in the West Bank, one vote, one time for a permanent leader. As I say, because there are not permanent facts and truth that the government gets to grand censor or dictate, we have elections. There is simply no point to elections if all the truth and every legitimate fact is determined and controlled by the government with an unquestioning press. That is a description of the Soviet Union and modern China, and it appears to bother nobody that we're advocating for that here. Well, it bothers me. There's no point for Democrats to try and restore the fairness doctrine, telling broadcasters what they can and cannot say, when the broadcasters have already surrendered their independence and simply constitute an amen corner for any progressive government that is elected to or takes power. If you don't thus think liberalism changed, try this. Here's William Brennan, possibly known as the most liberal Supreme Court justice of about 4 or 5 decades, certainly the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, perhaps the 90s as well. Quote, "Authoritative interpretations of the First Amendment guarantees have consistently refused to recognize any test of truth, whether administered by judges, juries, or administrative officials, and especially one that puts the burden of proving the truth with the speaker," close quote. Quote, "The constitutional protections of the First Amendment do not turn upon the truth, popularity, or social utility of the eyes and beliefs which are offered," close quote. Quoting John Stuart Mill, William Brennan said, "Even a false statement is deemed to make a valuable contribution to public debate, since it brings about the clearer perception of livelier impression of truth produced by collision with error," close quote. William Brennan would go on to say, but freedom to differ is not limited to things that don't matter much. That would be mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to things that touch the heart of the existing order. Close quote. Robert Jackson, Supreme Court Justice, put it this way: if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, shall prescribe what should be orthodox in matters of opinion, politics, nationalism, religion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are circumstances which permit this, they do not occur to us. Close quote. Then we also have, of course, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Quote, when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe even more than they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which wishes can safely be carried out. Close quote. If all those old liberals are too old for you, well, here's another old one, but at least he's still alive and serving on the Supreme Court, Stephen Breyer. Quote, whenever government disfavors one kind of speech, it places that speech at a disadvantage, potentially interfering with the free marketplace of ideas and with an individual's ability to express thoughts and ideas that can help that individual determine the kind of society in which he lives, help shape that society, and help define his place within it. Close quote. Not one other thing about Jen Psaki's response. So long as these private corporations, Facebook and Twitter, are doing the government's ideological bidding, they are free to do so. She said, quote, as always, it's a decision for the company to make and for any platform to make, close quote. It's not, as always, a private corporation's decision to make any decision they want. It is not, as always, when it comes to car manufacturers and emissions or safety or any number of other things, including the race ratio of employees at these automobile makers. And every other private corporation, indeed Facebook and Twitter, may be the only private companies in the world Jen Psaki and this administration do not believe are deserving of or earning of regulation. But the notion that the government can determine information and disinformation and truth is what frightens. As Leonard Hand put it, the spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the mind of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs its interests alongside others without bias. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to earth unheeded. The spirit of liberty is the spirit of him who near 2,000 years ago taught mankind that lesson it is never learned but never quite forgotten, that there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest, close quote. Let me shout what used to be the out loud part. The whole point of protecting speech, especially political speech, is to protect minority and dissenting views from the government, to defend the unpopular. That simply cannot or will not happen when the government is in the business of policing speech for their versions of veracity, aided and abetted by political forums that have built monopolies for political speech and advertising. Which gets me to the paranoia of the left and the Democrats, or at least their politicized paranoia. It all puts me in mind of Richard Hofstadter's famous essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which in the 1960s was used to tie Barry Goldwater to John Birch and Joe McCarthy and point out the connective tissue between the fever swamps of McCarthy and Birch, with the latter, Barry Goldwater, and as if that represented all of conservatism thought through and through. As Hofstadter put it then, angry minds that subsist on paranoia, bitterness, and extremism. American politics, Hofstadter wrote, has always been an arena for angry minds, but he later writes this in his famous essay, quote, the paranoid spokesman The paranoid spokesman sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He is always manning the barricades of civilization. He constantly lives at a turning point like religious millennialists. He expresses the anxiety of those who are living through the last days, and he is sometimes disposed to even set a date for the apocalypse. Well, I have to submit almost all of that is now on the left. Ecosystems disappearing before our very eyes, in which we have 9 years to act to save other ecosystems, or even if we act, it won't solve our problem, it'll just stop the worsening of them. Population devastation through lack of population control, nuclear winter, nuclear annihilation in the hands of Republican presidents, existential threat to the Constitution, existential threat to the environment, existential threat to America, fascism in the White House, worse than Hitler, constitutional crisis, impeachable offenses. Now, who are the millenarians of paranoia, which Hofstadter describes? The fate of conspiracy is in apocalyptic terms, he wrote, trafficking in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of values, manning the barricades of civilization, living at turning point, expressing anxiety, and talking about time running out of the last days, sometimes with a certain set date. All of that is on the left now. And this takes us to Peggy Noonan's essay on paranoia and conspiracy theories from Saturday. Again, though wrongly taking on the right. Her list runs from disagreements about the election to QAnon to the notion that Donald Trump will be reinstated. And she laments belief in these things, growing belief. Here's the thing, none of them are as accepted or culturally respected as things that actually matter, that are worse lies. Like the notion that children can be able to and should be able to change their gender, or that gender is something assigned arbitrarily at birth, or that men can and should be able to compete in women's sports, or that terrorist groups should be coddled and defended and have the moral high ground and be given defense systems. How about that America was founded in 1619? We're supposed to accept and believe all this, as we're expected to believe America, that twice elected an African-American president against the two most famous white politicians in the world, is institutionally racist, or that colleges which discriminate against whites and Asians in order to increase racial composition in their schools from African Americans are enlightened and will double down on such policies in order to expiate earlier racism, or that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians in 2016. On and on I could go with fever swamp conspiracies that have determined and changed so much, in contrast and contradistinction to someone mouthing off something about QAnon. In his essay, Hofstadter writes, quote, "The paranoid's interpretation of history is distinctly personal. Decisive events are not taken as part of the stream of history, but as the consequence of someone's will. Very often the enemy is held to possess some especially effective source of power, and precisely this is why Democrats still try to exploit January 6th. It is their evidence of proof of anti-Americanism in the Republican Party and conservative movement, and they are paranoid over it or want us to be paranoid over it. But understand, even assuming every rioter on January 6th was a conservative movement pro-Trump voter, and we know there were lefties there, but just assuming for the sake of argument that January 6th was an entirely pro-Trump event, that means we are judging an entire political party and movement by 5/10,000ths of 1% of its members and actors. That's a hell of a lot less than the 60% of Democrats who believe men should compete in women's sports and the other things I mentioned. And a hell of a lot less than those who believe in conspiracies from Donald Trump colluding with the Russians to everything else, which has dramatic and dire consequences on not only how we govern ourselves, but every part of domestic and foreign policy. It's fun and easy for the elites to go after asterisks and anomalies and exceptions in the GOP to try and taint the whole thing. The problem is their team's paranoia and conspiratorial mindset is a 5-alarm fire why ours is a small and controlled backyard barbecue. The danger is it is all twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. Don't fall for it.